I wasn't really wanting to interrupt watching Rachel. She just anyway. There's breaking news here in Utah. If you're not from Utah, you won't know about Operation Rio Grande. Operation Rio Grande was in 2017. It was before that, it began with a rich man wanting to build the Gateway Mall in downtown Salt Lake City. And of course, Governor Herbert loves giving money away to big businesses, and so the Gateway was built. The thing is that the homeless shelter was across the street from the Gateway Mall, and it's overflowing. It was overflowing, and just people lining the street, and horrible, deplorable conditions. I've been inside, so I've seen what it's like. Probably the Salt Lake County Jail is better conditions, but it was bad, and so they built this gateway, knowing of the homeless shelter across the street. So what happens once the gateway opens up and stores start buying lots and set up shop? Well, what happens is that the homeless naturally panhandle in the new location, and when the panhandlers are right out front of the stores, customers don't like going to the gateway. I remember going to the Barnes & Noble there on a regular basis back in 2014, and it was scarce. Not as many people going there, and you've got homeless all over the place. They were setting up home there, and so the gateway business people were complaining to the government, and the government then stepped in with a congressman who spent just one night as part of his investigative research, and it's now the police station there at the Gateway Mall, but it was just an abandoned place at first, where he stayed and had a one-way mirror so that he could see them, they couldn't see anybody inside, and they had the cameras going to watch what was going on that one night. And so then he goes back to the Utah Congress, tells them, hey, I got this great idea. We'll call it Operation Rio Grande. And it was at first announced to the public that it was going to be a way to help the homeless get out of homelessness, even though it was complaints about the gateway previously, and so we get news reports that there are no beds in mental health. They're all full. There's a huge housing crisis in Utah, not just with the homeless, but with the mentally ill, with the disabled, who qualify also for HUD, and the poor. We have families living together in homes, and their only solution is to build brand new subdivision homes and new apartment building, great and spacious buildings. If you know the Book of Mormon of Utah Mormons, you know what I'm talking about. The huge apartment complexes. But No poor person can afford them. Even with the subsidies of the requirements of Utah to provide a limited number of housing for at a lower price, the poor still can't afford that. And so these homes are for the rich, whether in the suburbs or these new apartment buildings. And so yeah, they're purposely exterminating the poor and the disabled and the homeless from Utah. And that's what the breaking news is. When the mental facilities said, we have no room in the inn, little Christmas reference for you, we then get word that the Salt Lake County Jail transfers a whole ton of prisoners to the different jails in the other districts and cities. And sure enough, Operation Rio Grande commences, and it's a raid. They have no intention of helping the homeless get out of homelessness. They purposely sought to have them thrown in jail for being homeless. And they justified it by saying, oh, we found some with drugs. That was an after effect, claiming that, oh yeah, they had drugs, therefore our raid was justified. And of course, with the large mass of homeless gathered in one location, they didn't think to have a certain number of cops. They were expecting everybody to just conform and comply and put their hands up and up against the wall, and everything would be peachy dory, whatever. And of course, no, they all fled. They scattered, and reports were that they went all over the valley, and new camps were springing up. But because it was winter time, the cops weren't going to do anything for that first winter, and they were going to figure something out in the spring. And so the officers had to request that more officers be pulled from other departments in other cities to come in and assist with this raid, Operation Rio Grande. And the people who were thrown in jail were just left there for months. And very few, like less than a handful, were taking advantage of the drug courts that they have here in Utah, which bypasses your rights to a trial, and you plead guilty and you go to sentencing in the drug court, and then that's also the probationary court for you as well. These other courts, they also have one for the mentally ill. That's the most horrific court you could ever think of, as the mentally ill are the most abused in Utah. They have human rights violations are at their peak here in Utah. So anyway, the officers were only able to get about 100 people arrested at the end of it all, leaving more than enough room in the Salt Lake County Jail. They thought too much of it, but the next thing that happened was, okay, that didn't work, and so what they then did was turn the shelter into a concentration camp, and they brought in fencing, they shut down the street, fenced it all off, made it a military zone with police officers patrolling the street, denying access to anybody. The caseworkers were set up there, and they had to be given IDs so that they can show the cops that they belong there. And the homeless who wanted to take advantage of those social workers, which in Utah there's already a crisis. There's nothing the social workers can do. Their homes are not available, and jobs are only for those who are experienced and educated. They don't have an overflow demand for Burger King jobs. And so there's no jobs available in Utah either. So there's a job crisis. And so the homeless know very well that caseworkers aren't going to do anything to help them. And so that didn't stop the Utah, who then created the Nazi program of IDing the homeless. They would have them fingerprinted, just like in jail, and given IDs to identify them as homeless, who are allowed to now access the caseworkers at the shelter area there. And so the whole place was shut down. And of course, very few people take advantage of that. For that reason, they don't want to be slaves and prisoners in the state of Utah. And so then the Congress decides, well, why don't we build more shelters? They're doing this all after the fact. It's like they react rather than being proactive. And so then they decide, okay, well, we'll make 3. We'll make 1 for women, 1 for men, 1 for couples, families. And so then they decide, let's ask Utahns which city we should put them in. And so town halls were held throughout the whole valley. And that was a big mistake, because Utah rose up in defiance saying, hell no, you're not putting a shelter in our area. There was a reason why it was all zoned into one location in downtown Salt Lake. Nobody wants the homeless. So, yay, I get to live in Utah. And so they then decided, well, we're just going to put them where we want them put, and tough luck on the mayors who get it and who refused. And so the women's is downtown, the men's is by the Salt Lake County Jail, also where the main office and housing for the mentally ill in Utah are. All located in one special place. Yay. That's going to become that's Utah's Auschwitz. Auschwitz, am I pronouncing that right? And so that's bad news in that area. And they then chose their contractor, who was the lowest bidder. And just this year, the contractor went to the government saying, we need more money, we're not going to be able to finish if we don't get more money. So the contractors screwed the government for more money with the lower bid. So good for them in that situation, but and the government of course paid it, and so it'll eventually be finished. The women's is finished, but there's already news complaints about how people are being kicked out because it's filled up, or there was a 50-year-old woman who was interviewed who wasn't going in because they were demanding the whole ID, and you have to go through caseworkers, and you have to do this, you have to do that. And these shelters are prisons. They're not official prisons, but you go through the whole process just like a jail. Getting ID'd and being forced as to how your life's going to go. And if you don't like it, you go to the streets. And so that's the new shelters situation. And so the breaking news today was the police in Ogden are now rounding up the homeless and forcing them into shelters. And they're doing it because they're concerned about the safety of the homeless, because we have a cold snap here in Utah. We had a hard freeze last month to start it all off, and that's unusual. And now we're having freezing temperatures already, which we haven't had here in Utah for years. So yes, there is a concern, but when you have shelters that are prison camps, and you have police that are forcing the homeless into these prison camp shelters for the homeless, that's a huge problem. And so I just wanted to get that out there, that Utah hates the poor, they hate the homeless, they hate the disabled, whether physical or mental. They don't like anybody who's not rich. And of course white, because how many percentage of Utahns are white? Yeah, it's in the high 90s. So yippee-ki-yay.